All right. Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited to have the honor of welcoming Nitya back to the stage, back to the Chicago Roboto stage that looks a bit different than in the past, but really excited to have her here today to talk about some really exciting new stuff in, I think, the general Android community with DualScreen and that sort of thing. So again, as a reminder, the Slack channel for Nitya can be found in the channels on the Chicago Roboto Slack. If you have any questions, we'll do some Q&A after. And make sure you preface the question with the question mark emoji so it's easy to find. But otherwise, welcome, Nitya.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. So I hope you can all see my screen as well. First and foremost, I just wanted to say I'm so excited to be back. The last time I was at Chicago Roboto was in 2017, so it's been 3 years. A lot has happened since. So I'm really, really excited. So hello, everyone. My name is Nitya Narasimhan. I'm currently a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. I'm excited to be back because I want to actually inspire and maybe excite people about rethinking the mobile app experience to take advantage of a whole set of new design affordances that we're going to have with dual screen and multi-posture devices. And so just a heads up before I kind of move on, this is my first time giving the talk, so it may go over. To make sure, what I've done is at the bottom of that slide, you'll see an AKMS link. There is a blog post on there. I will be posting my slides and all the resources there right after. I would love to also have you post your questions there, but I will check the Slack after as well. So let's get started. So a little bit about me. I've actually kind of been very fortunate to have worked in the mobile space for over 2 decades in various roles. I worked in research and development. I did some teaching. I was a community organizer. But over the past 2 years, to be quite honest, I did not do any mobile development at all. I walked away and joined the developer relations team at Microsoft, where I was working on building content and developer programs for the cloud and AI ecosystem in North America. And all that changed in 2020, and that's kind of why I'm excited. All that changed because in 2020, Microsoft launched the Surface Duo. And the Surface Duo is this little device, and I don't know if you can see that. But what made it really amazing to me is it's an Android device. It's an Android-powered device that has flexibility, it has portability, and it's kind of geared for a productivity audience. And I'm like, wow, this is cool. I need to go and jump in and start playing with it. And that's where my journey started, literally in September. So my goal today is actually a little bit different. So first, this is not a code-heavy talk. This is the first in a series of talks that I hope to give that'll kind of build on my learnings and adventures in this space. But my goal here was really simple. And this is a really nice color-coded slide, so you kind of know which section I'll be talking about at any given point in time. I have 3 objectives. First, if you're like me and you're entering the space and you knew nothing about foldables or dual screen devices, I want to just set the stage and create awareness about the terminology and some of the challenges and opportunities in that space in general. Next, I want to basically look at how we can exploit Android development support, the platform and ecosystem support for experiences in this domain, and use that to establish best practices and figure out how we can either build new experiences or enhance the experiences we already have. And that would be kind of like the green sections. But last but not least, I hope I will kind of inspire you to action. Because at the end of the day, I really want to kind of have folks go from having an idea of what they could do in a foldable device dual screen environment to actually implementing, building, running, testing, and experiencing it on one of these devices. And hopefully you'll choose the Surface Duo. So let's get started and kind of walk into the first section, which is foldable devices and dual screens. So I want to start with awareness and some terminology. At this point, we just want to say, what are foldable devices and dual screen devices, and why should we even care? So foldability, when I think about foldability is actually about one very simple thing. It's about form factors and flexibility, right? So one of the biggest aha moments for me was that effectively with the arrival of these foldable devices, we've erased this notion of a fixed form factor for our devices, right? So previously, when we were building stuff for Android, we would think about, well, this is a phone, this is a tablet, this is a laptop. But with this device, the very same device can morph from one to the other simply by the action of folding and unfolding the device itself. However, by default, and you can see there are two different examples here. On the left side, you see kind of like the green version that's on the Android developers page, which really reflects the use of flexible displays, right? A flexible display is where you've got like a bendable display, if you will, single screen rendering. And it's really not dual screen, but it allows you to kind of have like a foldable experience. On the right side, you see something like the Surface Duo, where you've got two separate distinct screens that are connected by a hinge. And effectively, that creates a different set of affordances or expectations from the user. So foldable does not imply dual screen. But what foldable does bring us in terms of an opportunity is really in the device state or postures. So you have different kinds of foldable devices in the market today. You might have something that's like a clamshell. The nice thing about the Duo is it's got this 360-degree hinge. So you might have multiple postures. So you might be able to read it like a book. You might be able to flatten it and read it like a brochure. You might be able to tent it and watch videos on it, right? So the more the number of postures we have, the challenge now is really about how do you establish app continuity for the user. So this user started off with a device in one mode, doing something. And if they flip this, the real interesting thing that I realized is it's a dual challenge. On the one hand, they expect the continuity. If they were doing data entry, it needs to continue on. But they also expect that there's going to be an enhanced experience. They're like, okay, I'm going to flip it to this widescreen mode so that I can actually get an immersive experience. So how do you kind of keep that tension together? So that's about foldable devices. The next thing we're going to look at is, dual screen, right? So what's the difference between foldable and dual screen? Okay. So with dual screen devices, you're looking at two distinct screens. In the case of the Surface Duo, you've got a symmetric set of screens. But really, the focus here is on display area and productivity, right? You're looking at what can I do if I can do things side by side, compare and contrast, maybe have one launch another experience, etc., right? Complementary content, augmentative experiences. The opportunity is in how you can use the second display to do interesting new user interaction modes. So on the Surface Duo, for example, you can now kind of have this experience where you have everything rendered on a single screen. You can drag it and suddenly have it go into span mode, which is where it's actually showing up across both screens. You can also have this notion of, like, if you have multi-instance apps, where you have two different instances of the same app showing on two separate screens, allowing you to do things like either compare and contrast, or even show off secondary content that was otherwise buried at some level in your menus, right? The other kind of interesting capability that in the Duo that's allowed is, like, as you start seeing the user use these experiences, you realize maybe they're always pairing these apps together. What if you were to kind of like group them and create an app group so that now you can in fact launch them together, right? Reduce the amount of effort the user does. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities for us to rethink the mobile experience. The challenge, though, is if it weren't enough that we were getting postures for configuration changes, now you have orientation. Like, are they holding it in landscape or portrait mode? Do they have it in single screen, dual screen, or span mode, right? So the number of attributes that we're going to use for configuration changes increases. And now you have a big challenge in how you're going to respond to them within your application. So that kind of covers the big picture of what, the two different aspects are, foldability and dual screen. But now let's talk about the Android ecosystem, right? What does it provide? As an Android developer, if I have a device that is foldable, has dual screens, and is running Android, what can I kind of expect in terms of default guidance from the platform? So we're going to dive into the green boxes next. So when you look at the green boxes here, I actually want to start first by looking at the evolution of Android and foldables, right? The very first time I heard the term foldables was in the Android Developer Summit. It was in 2018. And at that point, the first kind of low-hanging fruit issue that was being talked about was screen continuity. How do you make sure that I, as an app developer, know how my experience is going to be rendered, right? And so the low-hanging fruit was there should be a resizable flag that tells you whether, or that allows you to say whether your app will handle fold-on-fold transitions. Fast forward to 2019, and we could actually see that more capabilities as an expansion of the number of capabilities that you could do. And in particular, we heard about multi-display apps. So the real kind of interesting thing about multi-display, we had multi-window before, right? So you could do split screen, picture in picture. But in those cases, you usually had, when you kind of like see this, only one of those is resumed at a time, the other are paused. But in multi-display, all the kind of visible windows or the visible screens, display areas are active, the display activities are resumed, but only the top one gets focused. And this means that we now have to rethink some of the things like who takes hold of resources if all of them are resumed at the same time. So in addition to configuration changes, you need to think about consistency. Great, so now we've got that evolution, but we do have support. Fast forward to 2020, and we have one new thing that's coming into play. Till now, we were thinking about, okay, first we have to support multi-displays, but now, rather than just have one or two vendors and a standard way in which folding is done, we've got a lot of different manufacturers putting out devices and custom experiences. So we're seeing the start of the Jetpack window manager API that allows you to have a consistent or standard way to request information about the device state and the display features so you can then respond to them in your application. So that's kind of about how the foldable part evolved. But what about multi-screen? If you really think about multi-screen capabilities in Android, the continuum starts with, like back in the day, you had support for multi-window, right? You could do split screen, picture in picture. And what it allowed is for multiple activities to be on the visible stack. Evolved to like Android 10 and API 29. And now you have multi-display, which is multi-resume, resizable activities, which we talked about. But now in the latest, the multi-configuration space, we now can recognize different device modes. So when you talk about things like the Window Manager API, not only can I ask it to tell me which areas of this display can my activity render on right now, but you can also get a sense of, is it in tent mode? Is it in open mode? Is it in closed mode, etc. So when developing an app, bottom line is the combination of these two in Android means that we need two things. We need to, A, know how we can query the system to learn about the current device state and display information. And B, we need to know how to register to be notified of configuration changes in real time as they happen. So all that is great, but then if I want to step back, and really that was my intent behind this talk, I want to kind of like have us all think about what could we be doing if we start using these features, right? I really want us to think about how we can explore the space with a sense of like, what's possible. So there are three questions you need to ask yourself. What was the user's intent when they did one of these actions, right? When they folded or flipped or rotated the device, what was their intent? Was that affordance being used because the user had an expectation that something would happen to enhance their experience? So if they went from a folded mode to a flat mode, were they expecting that their screen would kind of convert into an immersive experience? Were they expecting that the additional real estate would give them secondary content? We need to understand this. Second, can we determine if the user's experience actually reflected their expectation, right? So was that continuity of experience there? If they entered stuff, did it show up? Did things disappear off the screen and surprise them? More importantly, if they had a particular intent, was that gratified or not? And how do we make this, like how do we kind of determine this? And last but not least, when you got through these two, which are really about generic Android support, the last thing is to look at the specific devices affordances. So a foldable, flexible display may give you a certain set of features. A dual screen display may give you an additional set of features, and the manufacturer may give you additional capabilities. How can you determine which device you're on and potentially unlock an additional experience? So we'll talk about spanning when it comes to the duo later. So at the core, when you think of just the generic Android device experience, this is the basic guidance, right? The good news is we have some basic steps we can think about. So first, for application continuity, adopt responsive layouts. Ensure that you have a consistent state and set your Android resizable activity to true and handle some of those changes yourself. Second, when you are in multi-window support, use things like drag and drop. If you haven't used it, start thinking of using it more consistently, especially when you have a dual screen mode, because drag and drop is not only intuitive, it is actually one of the most efficient ways to transfer information when you have two apps side by side. More importantly, when you're in multi-window mode, be kind of aware that resources may be taken away because the topmost activity gets resumed, and know how to gracefully handle resource loss. Third, you now have the ability to launch an activity on the second screen. So when that happens, you need to know within your app which screen you are launched on. Are you launched on the left screen, the right screen, where you span? How can you figure that out on whatever device you're on? All these three kind of like help you design, but what if you wanted to actually understand, like really look at the changes and understand if your experience matches your intent? All these devices are not cheap, right? So how can we go about testing out how our app responds to configuration changes? With Android 10, you actually have 2 foldable emulators that you can use to basically try out simple things like, getting single screen, dual screen, getting rotation angles, etc. When it comes to custom devices like Duo, we'll talk about that later. You might have even additional capabilities added. And last but not least, design patterns. And I want to talk a lot about that towards the end. But what I want to say is that some of the things that we want to kind of consider, we're only going to learn as we build apps. So design patterns are about understanding that certain kinds of behaviors should be abstracted out and reused. So for testing, this is what the Android default foldable emulator looks like. So as you can see, the 2 things you can do off the bat. On the left side, you have like an animation from the Android developer side that shows you how you can basically click on the little icon there to kind of have both fold and unfold events and see how you respond to them. And then the second thing is you can have rotation, so orientation modes, right? But this is pretty much all you have right there. As we'll see in the kind of Surface Duo emulator later, you can actually go so far as to play with hinge angles and other granular postures if you want to explore those. So this is all great, but the question that you're probably asking yourself now is, all right, I understand foldable devices and dual screen give me new affordances. I understand Android has multi-screen, multi-display support, and a whole bunch of capabilities like drag and drop that I can use. But how do I actually know what device I'm using, whether the configuration change happened, and how I should respond? Like, how do I subscribe to real-time notification events? Do I need to know the APIs from every single device manufacturer? Well, previously, you might have had to, but the good news is with Jetpack, Window Manager, which was just announced earlier this year, it's still an alpha, but what you do is you have a single API interface that allows you to query kind of like your platform for a standard set of device state and display feature data that maps to any device manufacturer, right? So with display feature, what you're really understanding is which parts of my screen are occluded. For instance, where is the hinge? Where is the fold? Use that to potentially do things like adapt your display, adapt your activity to kind of render things that are not occluded under that scene. With device state, the default Window Manager API has, I think, 4 states, 4 granular states that it provides, so closed, open, half open, and flip. But device manufacturers may give you additional granular levels. With this, you at least have the consistency of 4 states that you can use to kind of like customize your behaviors to. You can also subscribe to or register listeners to get notifications to change events. So the 3 links in there, the first one gives you a link to a post that describes these APIs. The second one gives you a link to the sample for the generic window manager. And the third gives you a sample that actually uses the Jetpack window manager with the Surface Duo to kind of provide a consistent way for you to use this on that device. So great. How am I doing on time? I think I'm okay. So far, now we get to kind of perhaps a little bit more of the exciting part for me. So we talked really about the blue parts, which is like understanding the foldable devices and dual screen ecosystem. We talked a little bit about what the Android best practices are and what kinds of support you have to determine the state and features of your device and the kinds of like capabilities that you have to actually do responsive adaptation. But now, what if you want to try it out on a real device? And this is where I want to talk about the Surface Duo. What is it? How do we get started? How can you kind of like test out your ideas without a device? And later on, what are some of the design patterns that we have seen through kind of like both anecdotal evidence and actually exploring it out with users that work for you in terms of getting off to a good start? So what is the Surface Duo? The Surface Duo, I actually have a device right here, and you can see it's actually really, really thin. It's a dual screen device, runs Android, and it's really thin, lightweight, and portable. Fits in a pocket, fits in a purse, right? Effectively, that's given me both a device that has the form factor that could be a phone, that could be a tablet, that could be used in like a composed mode, very, like a computer, and it is still portable. The most unique thing about it that I have seen is, unlike some of the other foldables on the market, which tend to be like clamshells, etc., this one actually has a 360-degree hinge. So you don't just have 3 or 4 modes, you have 16 discrete postures that you can tap into if you really want to explore different kinds of context. Third, the 2 screens that you have, the dual screen device, are symmetric, right? And there is a really unique capability called spanned apps, which allows you to have the user manually decide, take something that's on a screen, move it to the center, and we'll see that in a second, move it to the center of the screen and have it span both screens, hidden under the hinge, and really kind of get this immersive full screen experiences. But most importantly, and this is something that's really valuable if you are a person who kind of wants to potentially take your apps out into a broader market, the Surface Duo actually has 2 different app ecosystems. First is the Android ecosystem through the Play Store. The second is the M365 Productivity Apps ecosystem. And that's things like Teams and Docs, Word, all of that stuff that come off, like by default are installed. You also have access to the Edge browser, and there is support for doing dual screen web apps. We'll talk about that if time permits. But here are the development options. For today, we're going to focus primarily on Android developers and Kotlin and Java. But if you are someone who is interested in cross-platform development, there are actually samples, design patterns, and kind of like helper libraries that will help you work with React Native, Xamarin, and Flutter. More interesting for me, because I've also been a web developer, is that there is ongoing work to explore CSS queries, and I think it's called the Windows Segments API, that will allow you to support dual screen app experiences in mobile web. So if you want to check those out, those are also available on the site. But for now, we're going to focus on Android, Kotlin, and Java. So let's talk about 2 things. First, let's talk about on the Surface Duo, what are the kinds of configuration options you have. As I mentioned before, you have a hinge that has 0 to 360 degrees. There is an API that will let you get the actual value of the hinge, like 0 to 360 degrees. Nobody has yet figured out what they can do with the data, but if you have like a really cool game where every single angle of that hinge is going to do something different to your app, by all means, go ahead and let us know. We'd love to see it. But it's there if you need it. However, the granularity of the hinge is kind of bubbled up into 16 discrete postures. And you can look at this on the right side and look at the different kinds of modes that this allows, right? So with a posture, you're looking at peak, which is really a kind of like a very small, thin angle that lets you see a little bit of one screen at a time. A book, which allows you to see both screens, but it's very much like kind of potentially telling you that the user is in a read mode. A laptop style compose, where they put it down flat and are being able to look at one screen and do something productive, like have a keyboard on the other. A tent mode, where you're set up to like have a flipped device, so this way, and you're actually watching something, which is likely to be more of a lean back experience. And a flat, full screen, span mode, what are you going to do, right? So you already have enough postures. Now add to that single or dual. Are you using one screen or both? And are you using it in landscape or portrait? All combinations of these together give you a number of different kinds of attributes together, giving you a single context that you can use to adapt. But what's the default behavior? The default behavior is as follows. When you kind of like install, and by the way, every single one of your apps should work on the Surface Duo by default with no change whatsoever. The default behavior is when you install the app and you double click on it, it's going to launch on a single screen. You can then use your app, if set up to do multi-display, can launch an activity on the second screen if that second screen is available. If by chance you already had 2 apps, one launched on each screen, then when you try to launch an activity from your first app, it will launch over the existing one, just like default behavior. Nothing changed. You had to make no changes to your code. That's how it works. The other capability that you can have is moving your app activity from left to right, right? So you can actually have this done manually by the user, where they can kind of move it, drag it over to the other screen and have it rendered there. You can also do it programmatically, and there are helper libraries that will help you manage this. Last, multi-instance, having app support side by side. If you do, it strongly encourages you to kind of like support multi-instance behaviors, because it's a cheap and free way for you to explore some of these side-by-side app experiences by simply having your app run 2 instances, each one of them looking at a different perspective, maybe 2 different views of the data, maybe a list and detail view, whatever it is, where you basically have not made any changes to your code, but are able to kind of get a sense of what experience does the user like. But if I had to focus on one novel mechanism here, it's span. So when you're doing span, the app is actually displayed across both screens. So if you're in kind of like full screen mode, it's an immersive full screen experience that kind of, and you now have different interaction behaviors to get you out of it. But if you're not, then you're just spanning it. And now you have to figure out where you want to have your components laid out so that they're not obscured by the hinge. So we've already talked about basic Android guidance, and it stays exactly the same. So we already know the 5 things. Use responsive layouts so that by default, if you do nothing and you're not really trying to handle any of these events, it just scales to fit the screen. But if you can, use custom layouts that understand whether you're in single screen or dual screen mode, understand what kind of affordance the user is doing, and provide additional capabilities. There are helper layout libraries that we'll talk about in just a second. Second, support all configurations. Even though there seem to be different kinds there, one of the simplest value propositions I've seen is the ability to just kind of understand that the user put the device into a certain posture or a defined certain orientation while in my app, and then kind of try to figure out why did they do it? What were they trying to kind of achieve? What was the expectation of that experience? Third, support diverse inputs. Drag and drop out of the box is an easy one, but on the Surface Duo, you can also do pen events. You can also think of like the hinge angle itself being an interesting input. If you think of unique and interesting ways to use that as context to drive behaviors. So for instance, simply by flipping my device, I might be actually entering a yes or no answer to a modal. Multi-instance we talked about, but the most important thing that I want to come back to is this is all standard design guidance even from Android, but you want to learn user intent. Why did the user span the app? Why did the user change the posture or the orientation? And most importantly, our first guideline is never take actions for the user without their consent. Always allow the user to decide when they want to span an app and what kind of posture or what kind of actions they want to take in that context. So this is actually a place where now I'm going to spend a little bit of time, and hopefully I'm not doing too badly. Okay. The most important thing about the Surface Duo, as I talked about, is that it's 2 different screens and it has a seam in the middle, as you can see, right? So when you actually span it, you're going to have the kind of like the activity go under the seam, and you're going to see this like a dark seam in the middle. And now you need to figure out how that impacts the user experience. So what are the different strategies you can use to accommodate that seam, right? The first strategy is do nothing. And we're going to see some of these examples in just a bit. But the first strategy is do nothing. So in the case where your app already has an acceptable behavior, for instance, you're rendering a map view and you can scroll the map around to get it out from under the seam, then you're totally fine. Just using that as is without making any changes, right? Just test it out. Make sure that the user is able to understand that there are ways for them to see what information is hidden and move on. The second strategy is avoid it. And this is really about kind of figuring out where that seam is and making sure that any interactive components that you use, avoid it, right? So if you have a drop-down menu, make sure that it's dropping down away from the seam. If you have something that, if you're moving it from one screen to another, understand like how you should be dealing with orientation, etc. The third strategy is snapping to it. So snap to it is usually if you're using something like a grid layout and you have lots of columns of information or a gallery of data. If you can actually set it up in such a way that you have an even number of columns or grids, you can bring the seam into the middle where it kind of separates out. By putting the seam in the middle, you separate out your components on either side. So you're not really occluding anything interactive in the middle. Fourth and fifth are really kind of very useful for images and kind of rich media. And the first one, masking, is kind of like saying do nothing, because what it really means is that when you have images and there is a seam in the middle, if the image is such that the human eye can actually connect the dots and figure out what's underneath, people don't really mind it, so don't do anything. So if you have like a full scale kind of high resolution map, or even if you have like a picture that you've taken with your camera, it should be okay. They can figure out what's underneath it. Splitting, on the other hand, is saying literally kind of understand that there are 2 parts of this image, tear it in the middle, break it out and render it as 2 different activities on 2 different fragments on either side. But the most important takeaway from a design guidance perspective is if you are building something new, actually try to embrace the seam. Like try to figure out where are the cases where having the seam creates a natural separation of context that allows the user to understand that there are two different activities or two different interaction patterns and can kind of give you ways to remove cognitive overload. We're going to look at some of the design patterns in just a second that talk about it, but think about, especially when you create new apps. So I want to dive into how you can get started. So big picture is when you're working with the Surface Duo, you have more granular posture events. You have two screens, multiple orientations and configuration events. And in addition to that, you now have to kind of deal with things like span mode and the seam. How do you get started? We already talked about like the best practice for Android. So I'm just going to talk about 1, 2, and 4, which is where do you get the SDK and emulator? How can you test stuff out on the default emulator? And then what are design patterns that we have found that work for this, along with code samples that can kind of give you a jump start? So the first one, getting started. All of these links I'm going to put into the blog post that's at the link below. So in fact, they should be there already right now if you want to go check it out yourself. First thing is you can download the Surface Duo SDK preview. It contains the DualScreen libraries, it contains the emulator, and a bunch of scripts that helps you get up and running. Running the Surface Duo emulator for now is kind of like a two-step process for me. I'm on a Mac, and I'm sure that there are other kind of improvements happening, so I'll update my guidance there when I know. But for now, what you have to do is effectively run the emulator first using a standalone command line script. But once the emulator is running, it's a custom emulator, then your Android Studio automatically is able to determine that this exists and show that to you as one of the targets that you can deploy and run and test your apps against. Last but not least, go and get the Surface Duo SDK examples. When we talk about design patterns, there's literally both individual components, like just snippets that help you deal with specific examples of use cases that you want to do, plus hero apps, end-to-end solutions that use combinations of these design patterns that you can get started from. So what you see there is really what the kind of like the default Android emulator looks like. But in a minute, we're going to look at what we can do with the Surface Duo's custom emulator. So the default emulator, if you remember, had only two things, right? You can kind of like the Android emulator allows you to have foldable and unfold events that you can test against and rotation. With the Surface Duo SDK emulator, you actually have a bunch of other things. So first, that's what the span action looks like. So if you look at that first slide, there's a little bit like a little bar at the bottom of your screen in the emulator, a little white bar. And if you kind of pull that to the center, your activity will show up and you see the whole two-screen span, let it go, and now that application or the activity is being spanned across both screens, and you can then use that to manage the experience however you want. Do you want to kind of have that be a single large canvas? Do you want to split it into two different fragments? Whatever you like. So you can simulate spanning and test out your app experiences by using this particular feature of the emulator. Second, what if you wanted to actually emulate the granularity of those 360-degree angles, right? In the SDK emulator that comes from the Surface Duo team, you can actually overload the pressure sensor, or rather it is overloaded, and you can use that and set it to any range between 0 and 360 and kind of simulate that hinge angle. The same way, the humidity sensor can be overloaded and kind of used in a discrete scale from 0 to 16 to get 16 unique postures that you can test against. And last but not least, you still have the orientation, right? Landscape and portrait. So now I want to talk about what libraries are available to you. All of these are kind of like, I'm going to go quickly through them for time, but there are code examples coming up where you can actually see the usage of these. The most important one is the core SDK. It has two classes, a screen helper and a Surface Duo screen manager. And what they really do is help you in a custom proprietary way get information about the screen, the display mode info, and register for mode change events, right? So as we mentioned before, with the Jetpack window manager APIs, you can potentially move to using those directly. You might still want to use these to understand that you are on a Surface Duo device and get more granular information like hinge events and posture, like 16 versus 4. The Surface Duo team is planning to maintain these for kind of a length of time at least. So I expect that this would be a great way for you to test out ideas that may not expand across all the family of devices, but maybe custom fit for this. Second, bottom navigation. So Surface Duo bottom navigation view allows you to kind of have a helper that lets you move the view that is enclosed between left and right screen. So one of the design practices or design patterns is when you have, because the hinge will kind of occlude things in the middle, whenever you do move from single to span mode, move the navigation view to either the left or right screen rather than have it span, right? So you're able to not limit the user's interactivity. Using this helper class makes that fairly simple. The fragments handler, the fragments manager state handler, allows you to handle fragments in different screen modes. So whenever you move from one, fold and unfold, one kind of single screen, dual screen state, pick the right fragments. So when you're in single screen, there's a single fragment. When you're in dual screen, there's a start fragment and an end fragment. Pick the right fragments and restore their state to make sure that you have a seamless experience. And last but not least, the layouts. There are Surface Duo layout and a Surface Duo frame layout. Using these, it's really containers that allow you to define various kind of views that get managed for you and rendered for one screen and two screen experiences. So far we kind of covered what the SDK provides. So we looked at what the libraries were, what the emulator does, and where you can go kind of download the SDK and all of these components. But it would help if you were able to jumpstart your development process. And for that, there's actually a couple of really, really useful resources. First, learn about the 5 design patterns that we have seen through all kind of anecdotal and actual trial and error. 5 design patterns that might help you get a jumpstart on some of the applications you already have. And second, for each of these design patterns, and in fact, for some of the other features as well, there are code samples for Kotlin, for Java, and for all the other cross-platform frameworks that you can get and start from to actually kind of extend and learn from. So here are the 5 design patterns. At a very high level, extended canvas, list detail, 2-page, dual view, and companion pane. Each one of these has a certain kind of value proposition. And I also added a little kind of a detail in the next few slides that talks about how you could handle the seam in that particular instance. So let's look at each of these individually. So the first one is the extended canvas pattern. So you want to use the extended canvas pattern if you have a component that has a canvas that can, that can be extended to the entire view and will just expand to fill all available state. So examples could be a map view. It could be something where you've got a canvas that people can draw on, etc. So in this case, when you span it, it naturally extends under the seam. And for the most part, if you've got things like map views where you can actually move it around, the seam does not even occlude it. So your seam strategies do nothing. The canvas apps can be scrolled to reveal the occluded regions. And by default, you've got yourself an app that is born, span 2-screen and single screen ready. In each of these at the top right, the link that's there is actually a link to the code sample for you if you want to kind of fork that and start, expanding or customizing it. The second pattern is list detail. Now, list detail is one of the most popular design patterns for any Android app. So you've got a collection of content, and then you have a detail view for each of those items in that list, right? So in this case, this particular example uses the Surface Duo layout and the screen helper. The screen helper libraries allow it to reason on whether it is in a single screen or a dual screen state. And the Surface Duo layout allows it to automatically manage the transition and kind of have that layouts managed for single screen or dual screen start and dual screen end transitions for you. The seam strategy here is actually split it, right? So in some sense, this is one of those where the app lends itself naturally to taking advantage of the seam and using it to show that these are 2 different distinct content items, right? So any kind of list detail view that you're thinking of, use this snippet, get it automatic customized. It shouldn't take too long, and you should be able to have it run on Surface Duo and take advantage of spanning. Next thing is the 2-page. So 2-page really comes about for 2 reasons. One is, think of remember we were talking about how postures actually kind of give you a sense of user intent and in turn drive user experience. 2-page is about supporting reading postures, right? Suppose I'm reading content and I have 2 pages of content. A Kindle app is a great example, right? how do I do a book-like experience where you really have screens of content and you want the user to thumb through page after page? This particular sample uses the view pager and handles rotation events as well. So if you were actually in this mode and you were to rotate it, it automatically will change the scrolling to go top down versus right left. And it kind of manages the scrolling of all the different views. So it's a great place for you to start if you've got content that kind of fits in the immersive reading experience scenario. Seam strategy here again is embrace it because of the way it is, each one is a page. The seam just kind of like amplifies the fact that they're two different pieces of content. Dual view. This is actually one of my favorites. So dual view is about understanding that sometimes your app may have two different perspectives that manage or kind of provide the user alternative ways to look at content, right? So when you think about a map, this is the example up here. I may have a detail which tells me like all the details for a map, like think about like Google Maps or anything like that. I have a list of like a kind of like a list of directions that tells me how to get there. And then I have a view that lets me actually just see it visually, right? Take advantage of the fact that you can have side-by-side apps and create a coordinated content experience. The coordination here is important. It means that when I change something on the left side, the coordinated view on the right is actually also being updated to keep these two in sync. Seam strategy, again, is embrace it. In this case, you literally want to make sure that the user understands these are two different perspectives of some kind of shared data. And last but not least is the companion pane. The companion pane is actually one of the most interesting ones because if the previous one was about coordinating experiences where you have two different views that kind of work against a synchronized data model, here it's really about creating two alternatives or like augmenting this with additional content. This is a very powerful way for you to like take advantage of the real estate to do something different for the user. So in this particular sample, which comes from the photo editor kind of hero app, you can see that by spanning it, I can not only move the controls out of one side and get an immersive image on this side, but I can now add additional controls because I have the real estate area. I also think this is a really, really powerful way for you to do things like recommendation engines, right? Allow you to surface up things that would be 3 levels down in your menu because now you have real estate to show it. And that might teach you or kind of like get users to try out things they would normally try out. And those are the 5 design patterns. But if you kind of also want to get a sense of how these patterns are used together, the app that you just saw was the photo editor app. There is a source editor app and a two-note app. There are actually a couple of others that were just added recently. These are, again, all open source, and they let you look at examples of apps that use multiple patterns together. So, start from one of those and kind of figure out what made it work and then kind of extend it to try out new ideas. So I'm going to post this slide out. You can't do anything looking at it here, but I will post the slide out into that blog link that you see below. Each one of those is a link to a bunch of resources that you can use. The introduction to DualScreen is the starting point for everything you want to know about the Surface Duo, as well as the design patterns and all the best practices. All the others are kind of like Surface Duo specific, but if I had to pick one thing, I hugely recommend going and subscribing to the developer blog. They have a ton of articles coming out that have samples for Flutter, for React Native, for Xamarin, for Web, for Unity. And they kind of keep bringing up new stuff that is keeping ahead of the curve in terms of making sure they're compliant with some of the Android recommendations as well. Last but not least, if you do have questions, there is a community forum. If you are using the emulator, if you've tried the SDK out, if you have any feedback, we understand these are early days yet. There's a lot of stuff that is moving fast. But there's a community forum where you can post your questions and the Surface Duo team will actually respond to it. And of course, there's an Android developers Foldables, a design guide that's really helpful if you want to understand the generic design patterns and practices available. So with that, I'm sorry I took a lot of time. Hopefully, I'm just a few minutes over, hopefully. This is basically the whole talk in a nutshell. I wanted to really kind of give you a sense of what the DualScreen and foldable devices ecosystem was about in awareness, action, and aspiration. So from an awareness perspective, the things you take away is there's postures, there's number of displays and scenes, right? So your focus is on productivity and how you can use these affordances to deliver really good and enhanced experiences to the user. On the green side, you want to look at app layouts, understanding device states, understanding design patterns and display features, and really focusing on how you make your user experience continuous as the user transitions between fold and unfold states. And on the right side, you have links to all the things we talked about. The Surface Duo SDK with the emulator libraries and affordances that you can use, the design patterns with the code samples, and last but not least, content portals, code samples, and a community forum where you can go to learn more. With that, I will stop. I will say this is the first time I've given the talk, so I super appreciate any feedback. There's a lot of stuff changing as we go. So if you have any questions or comments, please ship them over. My next talk, I'm hoping to actually show an end-to-end app like built from scratch onwards. So if you have any kind of apps that you want to understand how you can use with DualScreen or foldable devices, or if you have any kind of suggestions for design patterns, I would love to hear them. And thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nitya. That was, for me at least, really interesting. This is such an exciting sort of new place for Android, and to see not only Microsoft, but Microsoft working with Google behind this is something else that sort of makes it really exciting. So if any of you have questions, again, the Slack channel, day1_Nitya, you can ask questions there, and we're sort of at the end of our time. So we're going to move all questions over there. If you have anything, Nitya will be around. And again, I thank her. And with that, I'd like to invite John up.
Howdy, everyone. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Nitya. Thank you, Ryan, and the rest of the team for emceeing today. I hope everybody had a great day, learned a ton of things. As Ryan said, this is it for the day. So thank you so much. Make sure to pop by the expo either tonight, kind of before you close out the stream, or we've got another day and a half. Reminder, tomorrow we start at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, UTC -6, for those that do international time zones better than I do. And with that, thank you all. I can't wait to see you all in the morning.